Have you ever read the New Testament of the Bible and wondered why Jesus' story is told 4 times, one after another, or why any of the books are ordered the way they are? In his book, The Untold Story of the New Testament, Christian scholar Frank Viola informs us that currently the books of the New Testament are arranged from longest to shortest, with Revelation tacked on at the end. He thinks that this is unfortunate, and invites us to hear the story of a New Testament in chronological, narrative form instead. He tells us the story in 5 movements. Movement 1. In eternity past, God desires to create human beings with which God can share the fellowship of selfless love that exists between the God's self as the Father, Son, and Spirit. Movement 2. Jesus is sent into the world by the Father to create this desired community. He lives in Nazareth in communion with his Father through the Spirit as he works daily as a carpenter. In his 30s, Jesus forms a community of 12 to whom he teaches to have fellowship with him as he has with the Father. He forms them into the desired community. He succeeds in everything that humanity, exemplified in Israel, fails at, and takes death that these failures cause upon himself so that humanity will not have to. Jesus, the Passover lamb, is sacrificed on Passover, resurrected as the first fruits of new creation, and sends his people to build and expand his church. They need to wait for the coming of the Spirit, however. After 40 days, Jesus ascends to the Father, where he now ministers as high priest on our behalf. Movement 3. The church is born, and the disciples of Jesus receive the promised Spirit of Christ. The Spirit works through them, and the good news about Jesus spreads. Early church communities commit themselves to the apostles' teaching, the Lord's Supper, and the good works. The gospel expands out of Jerusalem, and Saul is converted, and we know him as the Apostle Paul. The early church recognized those called for church planting, trained them, and then sent them. Paul would usually stay at a church community from between 3 to 5 months. Paul then writes the letter to the Galatians. The Jerusalem Council takes place, which you can see in Acts 15. And the non-Jewish Christians are given some guidelines in order to better coexist with Jewish Christians. James, soon after, writes his sermon to Christians dispersed through Palestine, emphasizing the works of faith to correct false understandings of the council's decisions. Apparently, as a result of the council, some wrongly thought that the good deeds were not too important. Around this time, Paul writes his final letter to a church in Philippi. Later, Paul writes his first letter to one of his fellow church planter apprentices, Timothy, concerning the Ephesian church. Luke then writes the Acts of the Apostles, detailing the powerful works Jesus continues to do through his church. Hebrews is then written about the need to have full confidence in Christ, especially as our high priest. Around this time, Paul writes to Titus, and then the Apostle John writes his gospel, followed by 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Paul writes his last letter to Timothy. Peter writes his epistles, and then they are both martyred. Jude, the brother of Jesus, then writes his letter, which has many echoes of Peter's works. John then writes the revelation of Jesus Christ from the prison labor camp island of Patmos to which he was sentenced. After the death of the apostles, man-made traditions infiltrate the church. Movement 4. The Son returns to earth. The lordship of Jesus is expressed over all things, and death is defeated forever. Movement 5. God's desired community, the church, is revealed as a pure bride of Christ. She is wedded to the love and fellowship existing between the Father, Son, and Spirit forever. If you want to understand how the story of the New Testament church makes sense in historical, narrative sequence, and you want to find your story as a part of this grand story, I highly recommend you to read The Untold Story of the New Testament by Frank Viola.